All right. Well, welcome, DevSecCon VA. Glad to be here with you tonight. I am going to turn it over in just a moment to our new and good friend Barry. But I just wanted to do a little intro tonight. It's the first event we've had in a little while, so I'm very grateful to Barry to jumping in here. And we're all remote this time, but we're going to be hybrid again very soon. And I do want to say that we have a couple of great events coming up. So take a look at devseccon.com to see upcoming events, and most of them are hybrid. So you can jump into one of the chapter events from all over the world. So with that, let me add Barry to the stage here. I'm going to mute myself. Barry, go ahead
Hi,
and
Micah.
introduce yourself. And then when you're ready, I'll add your screen to the stage and I'll take myself out.
Sure, you can actually go ahead and
Go ahead,
turn them
Barry.
on right now if you want to.
All right, here
Um,
we go.
Thank y'all for having me tonight, DevSecCon. I'm glad to be here. Tonight, I'm here to share a story from my career back in 2012, which was a very interesting and developmental year for me. I guess we'll call it. The time I accidentally ended up combating fraud for a year. My name is Barry Jones. You can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn. This is also known as the single weirdest year of my professional life. Quick bit about me. I went to Clemson University. I've been a polyglot developer and a DevSecOps practitioner for 21 years. I am currently a fractional CTO consultant through my company, Brightball. I'm also the organizer of the Carolina Code Conference in Greenville, South Carolina, who had its first relaunch year this past August, first time since COVID that the conference has happened. And I also teach GitLab training and certification classes, as well as Scaled Agile Framework training and certification classes through an affiliate called Seek Quality. But back in 2012, I was asked to take over as the sole developer of a 14-year-old marketplace in a company that was going through a crazy transition in complete chaos. They had tried to rebuild a 14-year-old site, botched the relaunch to a very buggy version that was ported over from a Perl site with no database to a Ruby on Rails and Postgres site. Brought everything down for 3 days. They couldn't reverse the changes once it came back up. Users were really upset. And it was a really crazy situation. So why in the world would I end up jumping into this, you may ask? And so the very short version of this is that in 2011, my contracting company that I had back then shut down, and I picked up a perpetual temp contract. It was basically 3 months at a time with continuous renewal. I like to call it a contract to fire contract, but I was working for Windstream, which used to be Nuvox in this area. At the time here in the Greenville area of South Carolina back then, you didn't have a lot of remote options that are nearly as prevalent as they are today. And so job options around here were really limited. And so I'd been running a company. I had a really diverse set of experience, but at the time, if you wanted to get a job, you needed 5 years plus of Java or 5 years plus of .NET. And if you didn't have that, you weren't getting most of the jobs around here. It was a tough market. And so one of my former clients called me during before lunch one day, asked me to meet him and because he wanted some advice on a bad situation that he was dealing with. And I figured it was probably about this, but he had prior to my company shutting down, he had asked us to give him a pitch, and we were overloaded at the time. We were shutting down. There was no way we could take it on. But I gave him some advice about it, about things to watch for that a contracting company would probably tell him was a good idea, but was probably going to get him in trouble. And for the most part, they did exactly what I told them they were going to do, and the bad things happened. And so when things went sideways, he called me to ask for help. And so we talked through options. I tried to put him in touch with somebody who could help. But by the end of the conversation, he ended up just offering me the job. And so it was a situation where I was having trouble finding a good long-term option, but it wasn't entirely just sheer desperation of trying to find a better long-term option. This was clearly a risky proposition. It was back shortly after the big Dig to Reddit fiasco, and everybody just watched Dig collapse from bad decisions. And we actually couldn't hire anybody even during the year that I was there because nobody wanted to jump aboard what looked like a sinking ship. And it could have very easily gone under. The only reason I came on board was because it was a situation where the company had a very strong network effect. And if you know anything about network effects, it's basically just a network effect is basically just the idea that the bigger your user base gets, the more your user base becomes a value add for the product, and it becomes harder for you to disconnect from the network. And so, like if you're looking at eBay, and this was basically eBay for a very niche marketplace, the buyers can't just up and go somewhere else unless all the sellers also go to the other place, and the sellers can't up and just go somewhere else unless all the buyers go to that place. So that buys you a little bit of time to hang around and work through some things. It did feel like the job was kind of made for me because I was used to wearing a lot of hats. I was used to doing sysadmin work. I was used to managing people and coordinating things and doing some triage. And the time that I was at Windstream, I'd actually been doing 9 months of very heavy Perl work, oddly enough, which I didn't really touch that much otherwise, but it kind of prepared me for it. And the rebuild was in Ruby on Rails. I didn't know Ruby on Rails at the time, but I was really familiar with it from some other similar frameworks like PHP that were built on similar positions. But it seemed like it was a really good fit, and I honestly couldn't imagine this guy who was a friend of mine finding anybody else who could do it. So I decided, you know what? I talked to my wife and decided, let's do it. If nothing else, it'll be interesting. Shortly after that, I found out exactly how bad it really was, and it was a train wreck. It was really, really, really bad. So the site had over 300,000 users, and at the time that I came into this, I was quite literally the only developer. There was an owner, there was a COO, there was a salesperson who was selling ads to clients. There was a project manager who was the friend who had hired me. And then there was me. So there was all these levels of overhead and just one developer, me. The users were all really, really ticked off. There were sellers whose entire businesses depended on this site, and it had upended everything that they were doing in their lives. Our staff, as we grew and added some support people and everything as well, we got death threats, legitimate death threats. One guy's business went under. People were threatening to drive down from an adjacent state and kill us all. That's what happens when you threaten people's livelihoods. A company named sucksnow.com site was created to chronicle just how bad everything really was. It was a mess. And so when I walked into this 14-year-old site was running on 25 Perl servers. They were not specialized. They were just multi-purpose servers. Some of them had different versions of the code deployed. There wasn't a versioning system for the code. It was running Perl. It was running in some data center provider I'd never heard of. And I kid you not, this was 2012. It was running a version of FreeBSD that had not been updated since the year 2000. Not patched, no updates to libraries, anything. It was a 12-year-old version of the operating system on all these things. It was running this site. That was handling a lot of transactions. And so they had hired an Atlanta-based contract development shop that had rebuilt the marketplace portion of this. So there were forums and reviews and other aspects of the site besides just the marketplace. But the marketplace was the real core where the money happened. And so they focused on rebuilding that first. When they rebuilt it, they left out pretty much all of the security features that had been built into the previous site, though, which was complicated. And so the previous support staff and the tech lead who had built the entire thing was no longer there and unavailable. Apparently, there was some contractual obligation to be there through the site migration. I never got the full story on this, but basically left once the site migration was done. And so the site migration itself, it was one way. They migrated the Perl site to the Rails site for the marketplace. It took everything down for 3 days. It was not a reversible thing because you had a file system based package on the Perl site. That was the database, was just the entire file system. And then you had an actual legitimate database on the other side. And code had been written to read everything from these other files and then map them and load them into the database and build it into a structure. But there was no way to reverse that process. And so once the new site was up, you were stuck with it. The new site had not been tested in a production environment prior to the migration, and it was very, very buggy. But with the entire scope of the project, they rebuilt this entire thing in 9 months, and realistically, it actually was pretty good work, even though there were some bugs. And it was really just an issue with properly QA testing the launch prior to launching it. But it is what it is. Right after that, we got our first phishing email, and phishing happens all the time, so this shouldn't be that big of a deal. But in this particular case, it was way worse. So one of the critical things about this site was that for 14 years, this site handled all transactions between all of the users. And just imagine going on eBay and then doing every single thing over your personal email. So every person you interact with gets your email address. Which means that anybody who engaged with anyone on the site was able to just sit back and collect email addresses of the different users on the site associated with their usernames. The fact that we had this migration in process where there were parts of the site that were still in the old structure and parts of the site in the new structure, you had different designs, there were different addresses for things. It was really easy to confuse users with where things went. The email hygiene around this project was really bad. So the new Rails site, to their credit, was actually set up to send through SendGrid. So everything was kind of sending through a managed transactional email provider, which was great. The Perl site setup was actually, there were those 25 servers. About 5 of them were dealt with sending email as well as hosting actual Perl site code, but they also send email. And what these things were set up to do, they would send email, but they monitored blacklists to find out when they had been picked up on a blacklist. And if a server was picked up on a blacklist, then they would relay those messages to a different server until it came off the blacklist, so that it could start sending back through the original server again. And there were 5 of them, and they were basically just playing musical chairs with the blacklists until everything worked again. But the biggest thing that made it really, really difficult was that that first phishing email that came through looked just like our emails. There were no typos. The only thing that was different was the link that it went to. And the email address that it came from was from our actual real domain name. And so users didn't have any way of telling a difference unless they were inspecting the link that was hidden under a button. That was really dangerous. This freaked me out. I had never been in this situation before, and I did not handle it well. My first instinct was to go say, reset everyone's password. Everyone's getting a new password. Everyone's been compromised. I was overridden on that, and we did not actually do that. But what I was allowed to do and what I kind of found out through that experience was that I had some constraints to work with. See, the management of the company was completely freaked out based on the perceptions of what everyone was going through with this experience. And so they, people were already so angry, and they were worried, and the owners were legitimately worried about their business going under. And that's completely understandable. So they didn't want to do anything to upset anyone else. And there was, for the most part, there was an older user base to the site at the time, and people who were very stubborn from a lot of support interactions. I'm not just biasing this. There was a lot of support interactions, people who were very stubborn about doing things like changing their passwords or even using a password longer than 4 characters, which sounds crazy because it is. But I was not allowed to force an increase on the character length because there were people that paid a lot of money to the site that didn't want it to change. And we couldn't even make them go through any extra steps like 2-factor authentication, which was not nearly as available at that time. It was not nearly as frequently used back then as it is now. But so we had to deal with all these problems. We had to find a way to protect everybody without asking them to do anything differently. And so this presented a really interesting challenge. And I ended up turning this into a presentation and then and sharing it over the years. I mean, I've been talking about this basically since my non-disclosure ran out back in 2014. And I even got invited to MOG in Atlanta one time to share a variation of this talk. And what I found out when I was in MOG was that I got to have a really unique perspective of this, because usually the types of stuff that we had to deal with at this company are dealt with by different divisions and different departments at larger companies. It's rare to see this level of attack coming from all angles from a small company where only a few people can see everything that's happening. And so it's made for a fun story because of that. In hindsight, it was not fun at the time. But so here's what we were dealing with. Users were getting phished. Their accounts on the site were being taken over. The phishing emails were coming straight from our domain, so people couldn't tell heads from tails. They were getting directed to various fake login pages and phishing sites. And then as soon as somebody would get into the account, they would change all the contact information to lock the original owner out before they could reset anything. You would have people coming in and creating fake listings to actually scam buyers, fake purchases to scam sellers. They would end up using stolen credit cards in these transactions, and we would be dealing with chargebacks for it as well. You'd have Western Union scams, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. And amidst all this chaos and everything going sideways and everybody being mad at us, there were over a dozen competitor sites who were actively trying to lure away our users. And they were using our own systems to contact our users and spam them to do it. And the fun thing about this is that if there had been one competitor site that everybody was saying, go to this site, we would have been sunk. But there was no Facebook to our MySpace. There were 12 much smaller sites, and they all wanted to be the new main site. And so they were all competing with each other at the same time as they were competing with us. And it kept there from being a clear exit path for all of those users to migrate away from us to something else. That's what gave us the time to get through this. So understanding network effects is something that I think is definitely important for a lot of people. But it was nuts. Users, were of course losing trust in the site. They were getting frustrated. They were getting angry. They were getting sick of dealing with fraud on the site and the various people who were actively defrauding them. And so we just had to find a place to start. And so what we ended up doing is we decided, we're going to just start with the phishing sites. Let's go after that first. And so, I didn't know anything about email at the time, so I didn't really know what to do with this. But when you looked at a bunch of the phishing emails, what we found was that a bunch of phishing emails were being sent out to a bunch of different users, but they're all pointing back to the same phishing site that was collecting all the information from people. And so we said, okay, well, maybe we can just take down the phishing site itself and it will render the phishing email useless. Never done this before, but we figured let's make some phone calls, see what we can do. So we did some lookups. We found out where the sites were hosted. We contacted the abuse teams of those hosts and, conveyed the situation to them. And they went, oh, yeah, sure, we'll take it right down. And then, that's fine on the first call. Like the 20th time they hear from you and they're starting to slow down. They start to deprioritize it with everything else that's coming up. The takedown still did work eventually, but it just wasn't really that fast. And one of the experiences that I remember being really frustrated about was I was on the phone with one of the abuse teams at a hosting company in the UK. And I asked him, like, so you've taken the site down. You can see everything that's hosted on the site. You can see all the files and everything. Can you see if it actually has the credentials that people have entered into the form? And he said, yes, I can see it. It's right here. It's like, can you just give me the usernames so that we can go and flag the user accounts on our system, since we know that they've given up their password to a criminal? And he said, I can't do that without a court order. And that was frustrating because, you got two people who are actively working to try to protect the users of a site, but you can't give them the information that helps them protect them. And so we were in the US, they were in the UK, and that was a hoop that we weren't going to be able to jump through, unfortunately. But the takedowns were working. They were clearly getting to the phishers, and they started adjusting their tactics to adapt to ours. They started using hard to reach international hosts. My favorite one was they sent a phishing email out at 5:30 right after our workday using a South African host that it took forever just to find the contact number to get a hold of the people we needed to talk to deal with this. And then once you contacted them to take down the site, there was confusion, there was some language barrier, there was some miscommunication. We still got it taken down, but you realize that this is not a sustainable process. And so we also tried the report a phishing site tools that are out there. Like Google has a place where you can submit the URL to report a phishing site. Microsoft has it. McAfee has it. U.S. government has it. And there's another site out there that I really liked because they responded quickly. It was called Fish Tank, which was run by OpenDNS. And we looked at it, and for Fish Tank, they actually responded typically within a couple of hours. That would be blocked for any users of OpenDNS. Google and Google DNS was typically blocked within about 8 hours. The others were kind of a black box, and response times were really, really slow. That was back in 2012. Hopefully things have gotten better now. But having hours for takedowns doesn't work because there's this term called the golden hour that was coined by IBM back in the day. And they did some research and found that 50% of phishing victims' credentials are harvested in the first 60 minutes after an email is received. Within 5 hours, 80% of credentials, and within 10 hours, 90%, which means that blocking a phishing site or taking down a phishing site after a few hours is a complete waste of time. It's not going to be effective or sustainable. And so right about this time, Google had just posted about this thing called DMARC. And I didn't know anything about email. I was doing a lot of web development and server-side development work at that time. All I typically cared about in 2012 was, if I have a site that's set up to send an email, does it get delivered? Wipe your hands, you're done. That's all that really matters, right? So I didn't really know what this thing was, but I knew that it had some stuff about blocking bad emails in it. And so I figured I would needed to read up on this. And the standard had just come out. And so I figured we'd figure this out. So I'm going to give you a really high level about kind of how email works and why you end up needing something like DMARC in the first place. So we're going to have a short DMARC lesson here. This is not a DMARC talk, but you're going to get some DMARC information because you need it. So essentially, if you think through the differences between having a domain with a website versus a domain with an email, if you have a website domain and you go buy a domain and you decide you want to set up a website, you might go to a web host, you'll set up a website, and you'll get the information from that host to point your site to point your domain at it. You'll go to the DNS and you'll add one of a few different types of entries to tell the internet, if somebody types in this domain name, go here for the website. And so when somebody goes and types the address in their browser, it will go to the DNS, it'll look up where that site is, and then it'll get that address, and it'll send your browser to go look at that address, and then boom, there's your website. With an email, it's very, very similar. If you want to receive email at that website domain that we're talking about, you'd set up what's called an MX record, or a mail exchange record, that points to your receiving mail server. And so when somebody says, I'm going to go send a message to Barry at example.com, it's going to look up the MX record for example.com, and then it's going to send the message there. And then when the mail server gets it, it says, okay, who's Barry and which mailbox does this need to go to? And so that's what happens essentially when you send an email, or when you are wanting to receive email for your domain. To send email, here's everything you have to do. That's it. Nothing at all. By default, anybody can send an email claiming to be from any domain on the entire internet from anywhere at any time. All they have to do is say, I'm from here. And that is why we have a giant spam problem. It really is that bad. I wish it wasn't. But anybody can send email claiming to be from your domain because there's no validation to it. And this is why spam and phishing are such a hard problem. Because essentially every email provider, Google, Microsoft, whoever, they all roll their own anti-spam formulas. And they do this by a combination of things like IP reputation systems, blacklists, DNS inspections, reverse lookups, all sorts of weird magic and patterns that they're seeing with their AI technology. They'll inspect the content of the messages, and they'll use some various scoring criteria. Ultimately, they're trying to first identify, is this legitimate or is it not legitimate? And then even if it's legitimate, it could still be spam or phish. It's just trying to verify a whole lot of things. And so they all got their own sets of rules. And if you've ever dealt with, if you've ever seen companies say, oh, don't forget to add us to your address book, that's pretty much because most of their mail is getting filtered and they want, and whether you're in that provider's address book is one of the filters on things getting by. And so, when you think about it, every single domain since the founding of the internet has email turned on from everywhere by default. So how does DMARC help with this problem? What DMARC does is it lets you publish a simple DNS record that tells a receiving mail server, hey, I know where all my email's coming from. If you get stuff from the places that I'm not listing it from, it's not for me, and you should ignore it. And they'll even send you a report about how they handled things, so you can see what's going on. Again, this is not a DMARC talk. I'm giving you a very high level, but it's based on essentially two standards. One's called SPF, and the other one's called DKIM. They both have different trade-offs, but when you put the two of them together, they really fill the gaps of each other well. And so SPF is a simple DNS entry. It basically just lets you identify the IP addresses or groups of IP addresses of servers that are allowed to send email on behalf of your domain. It's really easy to set up. All you have to have is DNS access. The problem with it is that SPF does not survive email forwarding. This would be really easy if it was just mail server to mail server. But if you've ever been part of a mailing list or a listserv group where you send an email in and then it sends it back out to a broadcast group of people, or you have a forwarding address, or I know a lot of universities will do alumni addresses where you can get a forwarding address to point to wherever your real email is. It's going into that, and then it's being sent again from that server. And since you can't control the person sending you the message saying that the other place that they just sent it to is also allowed to send it on their behalf, the SPF check will not survive email forwarding. DKIM is domain keys identified mail is different. It basically lets you put a signed public-private key email signature in the message, and then when the receiving server gets it and it sees this DKIM key in the top of it, it can go look on your DNS, it can get your public key, and it can validate whether this legitimately came from your domain or not, or at least somebody that had the private key for your domain. It's a little bit harder to set up. It has to be set up on each mail server that sends on your behalf. So if you've got something that's sending like a newsletter service, and then you've got a transactional email service, and then maybe you've got Google or Microsoft for your main company email. Each one of these has to have DKIM set up on it, and that's what it's made for. It's a little bit harder to set up for that reason, but it survives forwarding. It fills that gap in SPF. And it also requires periodic rotation, just like secure certificates on a website do. But those expire by default. These don't. So you really have to be diligent about it. Most third-party providers will do this for you, so you don't have to worry about it. If you get one that doesn't, you need to insist that they start. Invalidating it, checking whether or not the DKIM check failed is easy. What's not easy about DKIM is that if a receiving mail server gets an email that doesn't have a DKIM check in it at all, it doesn't know if one was supposed to be there, because the DKIM check tells them where to go to check to see if it's valid or not. And so the combination of these two things really covers your bases. And so DKIM hygiene is fun. One of my favorite stories from back in the day was featured in Wired magazine back in 2012 about this guy named Zachary Harris, who got an email from Google, and he is Zachary is a math guy. And he looked at the email and he thought, Google sometimes did these weird recruiting tests, and he found that it had a 512-bit DKIM key in it. He thought there's no way Google is using a key that weak. And so he thought it was a recruiting test, and he cracked the key. He used the cracked key to send an email from Larry Page to Sergey Brin. And 2 days later, Google had a 2048-bit DKIM key. So key strength matters so that it can't be easily cracked, but you also have to rotate it. Even having a very high strength key is not enough, because it can still be compromised. It can be taken by a departing employee who had access. It could be compromised through a breach, or it could be cracked. And especially now with all the cloud power that we've got out there, you can farm out a lot to get to these things a little bit quicker. But there's the full story of that is over on Wired if you ever want to read about it. It's a lot of fun. Ultimately, the result of this, though, is that I am a firm believer now that DMARC is magic. Phishing emails from our domain stopped. We enforced this. We put DMARC out. It took us about a month or so to carefully roll it out. So just so that since we didn't really know what we were doing, we were being really, really careful about it. But our reports of phishing dropped from multiple reports per day to less than one per week after this. And since nothing that was actually impersonating our real domain was getting through, the fish started resorting to using lookalike domains, or domains with essentially the same name, but where some of the interior letters were switched out. These were a little bit easier for users to identify because a lot of our users, unfortunately, were really on guard by this point. But it was still a better situation than what we were dealing with. And the only thing you can really do about those is defensively register those domains and then turn off email from them with an empty SPF record and a reject DMARC record. And you can contact the domain owner and ask them to set up DMARC if they're not using it, and just let them know what's happening. But the problem wasn't gone entirely, but things were dramatically better after this. And if you want to learn more about this, there's actually a report that I got to present back at the Anti-Phishing Working Group's e-crime summit back in 2018 in San Diego. And after this, I was such a big fan of DMARC that I actually went to work for DMartian for about 3 years. And we got the opportunity to cross-reference DMartian's decade-long trove of DMARC reports against the APWG's malicious IP database and phishing database. And what we did was we just basically took a slice and a subset of known malicious IPs at a particular point in time, and we cross-referenced them with IPs that were showing up in the DMARC report to see if we could find any patterns. And one of the interesting things is that when you set your DMARC policy as you're rolling things up, you start out with a policy of none. You're just getting the reports and making sure things are configured correctly. And when you're ready to enforce it, you bump it up to quarantine, and then anything that doesn't pass, you're telling the receiving mail server to send it to the spam folder. And then when you're completely sure that everything is right, you turn it up to reject, so that it doesn't even go to the spam folder at all. And one of the things that we found is on the issue of hacked DKIM keys was we cross-referenced the different patterns that were in there to find out what was going on, if there was anything interesting. And when you had a policy of none, an unenforced DMARC policy, we saw these malicious IPs sending emails on behalf of these domains that were actually passing DKIM. That's what that big blue bar is on the screen right there. As soon as there was an enforced policy of quarantine or reject, if they had a cracked private key, those emails would have still worked because you had the DKIM key. You had the ability to send an email on behalf of the domain because you had the key to say it did. So in theory, there should have still been plenty of these as soon as the policy got turned on. But as soon as there was an enforceable policy of quarantine or reject, there was none. It was as if by having an enforced DMARC policy out there, people did not even try to attack the domain. And I found that really interesting. The entire report is on DMartian's website. It's called Phishing Leaves a DMARC Trail. If you want to go search for it, there's the link for it right there. There's a lot more information in detail if you want to get into it. So one thing that you can take from this on any domain that you're working on is disable email on your unused domains. Don't be part of the problem. And you can do this really easily. You just have to go and enter 2 TXT records in your DNS. And so what you'll do is you'll enter an SPF record like that one that I showed right there, which is just a very short empty record. And you'll do the same thing with, And you'll do the same thing with the DMARC record. You'll just have a basic DMARC record with reject. What these records do right here is the FPS record just says there are no servers authorized to send email on behalf of this domain. And the DMARC report says, or the DMARC record says to reject anything that is not authorized to send on behalf of this domain. So by default, it's saying don't allow anything from this domain because nothing's allowed. And then when you're actually ready to start using the domain for something, you just add it to the SPF record. Final notes about DMARC. If you're going to set it up, it's easier to do it if you've only got a few mail servers. So do it early and quickly, and then it's just easy to keep plugging new things in as your system grows. The bigger your company, the more things you've got to rope in and figure out what's coming from where. And so it's more of a project. This is where consultants come in, like me. And I can definitely help with that kind of stuff if you ever need it. But it's also becoming a requirement. So if you don't have it set up with your company, you probably are going to need to do it soon. It's been a federal requirement for agencies mandated by the Department of Homeland Security since 2018. The Dutch government requires it for all businesses that operate within the country. It's part of something they have called the comply or explain list. Adoption is actively being encouraged or mandated globally. And from what I've heard, it's also going to become a part of the security standards that are out there, like SOC 2 Type 2 and ISO 27001 at some point in the near future. There are a lot of services out there that can help you get this stuff set up, myself included. And I've even got a 3-part DMARC guide that I wrote as part of this blog series that we're talking about here, if you want to learn more. All right, enough about DMARC. Now let's get to the passwords. These were fun. If any of you can read these and not chuckle, I will be surprised. But people get funny about passwords. They're very frustrated with password policies and password rotations and all the other password rules that are out there. And so since we know that people are being phished, we know that people are falling for it, and we know they have weak passwords, we have to change the way that we're approaching this problem. And so the way that we're going to handle it is we're going to frame the problem differently. We're going to assume every single account will be compromised. We're just going to assume there's a published list of all of the usernames and passwords of every user on our site. Do that exercise as a team within your company for any project that you have. Because this is the reality that we live in now, where there's a breach every other week. Far too many people use the same email address and password combination at multiple companies. And as soon as a breach happens somewhere else, people will start trying to farm those credentials out across other systems. Clearly there's good ways to deal with this, but a lot of people don't use them. So how can you protect your users from this situation? So today there's a pretty easy answer to a lot of this, with multi-factor authentication, 2-factor auth. I just got my parents set up with 2-factor auth on their email last week. They were able to do it, but they weren't happy about it. But, back in 2012, it was not as prominent. We weren't allowed to change user behavior. So something like this wasn't really an option for us. And we couldn't even ask them to set longer passwords. So we had to approach the problem from a different perspective. If people got in, how did we fix it? How did we detect it? So step one, when an account is taken over, we needed to make it easy to reverse that takeover. Okay. So get some water here. All right. So one of the biggest things is that our support team, we only had 2 support people at the time that was dealing with all this. If someone's account was taken over, support had to find out about it. They had to verify the person they were talking about was the actual real owner of the account. Then they had to go through and manually reverse it through some various steps in the database. And then they had to ask the person on the phone or on the support channel to go through and actually change their email address to something different, finally, and which they would grudgingly do after their account was compromised. But that takes a lot of time. And this is actually a very easily fixable problem. And this is something that I really wish was built into almost every open source login system that's out there, because in my view, this is something that should really be default behavior. Because all you have to do to fix this problem is to track every email address change. You just create a separate table. You track every single change from what the email address was to what it became. You track the timestamp with it, and you don't finalize the change until after a confirmation email has been sent to the new address that they have to, of course, click the link or whatever else to finalize the change. After the change, you create a reversal key on that change, and you send an email to the original email address with the reversal key. Now, this is important. When the user clicks the reversal key, what will happen to say, I didn't authorize this change, I did not want my email to be changed to this. You click the reversal key, they visit the site, the reversal key will immediately clear out all reversal keys that came after it for that account, not before, just after. And then it will force the user to change their password. The reason that this approach is critical is because once someone gets into an account, what's the first thing they do? They change the credentials. A lot of sites, if you've spent any amount of time looking at user databases, you will see there is an email address field. There's a users table. There will be an email address field, and there will be an old email address field. So if you change it twice, the original email address is gone. The people perpetuating these scams know that. And so all you have to do is just go and change it a couple times, and you're done. Additionally, if you were to go through and change it 20 times, and at the 10th, and say you were the scammer, you go and change it 20 times, and then you decide to hit the reverse button on the 10th time to change it back to whatever the 10th iteration of that was. That's fine. You've canceled out everything after that. But the original email that went to the user the very first time you changed it, still going to work when they realize their account's been compromised and they just click the button and want their account back. And so reversing the change will, of course, tell people that tell the user that you've got to change your password. And of course, you're going to want to track the IP address every single step of the way. You want as much forensic information as you can get. And fun side story about this is that I actually wrote this up. I wrote this blog post up after the Experian breach a little while back. And Brian Krebs actually retweeted my article out, and it got some traction. And that little bit of encouragement from Brian Krebs sharing this particular article is what got me to write this entire blog series in the first place. So thank you, Brian. All right. So the other thing you're going to want to do is when you have IP addresses, you want to have some idea of the geographic area of those IP addresses. There are lots of geographic IP databases that are out there. You can build them yourself as well. There's also some guides out there to do that. But some readily available ones are from MaxMind. Cloudflare will put it in the headers for you. There's an Nginx GeoIP database as well. What you're going for here is you want to get a general idea of the regular geographic area that your users are logging in on for a particular account. And so from that, you want to see if a login comes out from somewhere far outside of the area where they happen to be. And you can widen or narrow this based on the perceived risk of the account. So a brand new account that hasn't done anything on the site has no risk whatsoever. They can be logging in from all over the world all in one day. We don't care because there's nothing that can be lost with this account. A seller account that's actually had some transaction is building up their basis. You might have a slightly narrower area there. So if something comes in from outside of the region of the country that you happen to live in, maybe you send an email validation to warn them about it. A major seller that's got lots and lots of transactions that's doing business on the site, it's an advertiser, you might consider that a more high risk account. And if they're typically only logging in from within a few square miles or their store every day or something like that, then maybe you make them go through a verification process of getting an email saying, hey, is this actually you? And if they get the option that, this wasn't me or I'm traveling, you tell them what region the login came from. And if it wasn't them, you force them to change the password. And one of the things that's important about this process is that with everything that we were dealing with at the time, the management of the company, again, did not want users to perceive any security risk whatsoever. We were doing everything we could to protect them without them seeing us, but the management of the company was absolutely petrified. People were going to get more upset if they had to do anything different. And we pushed this through anyway. And it was one of the more rewarding things because the users, when they got these messages, they were really happy about it. They loved it. They loved knowing that the site was actually looking out for them and warning them about things to protect them. And they wrote us messages telling us how much safer they felt because of this. So that's something to keep in mind whenever you're dealing with, pushing security items through for it, because nobody ever wants to work on the security stuff. Everybody's always focused on features. Even when you're not triaging a situation like this, it's always feature. And the security stuff is important, and it's typically just a matter of communicating the value of it and making sure that users know it. And the great thing about it was that this essentially stopped the problems. The combination of the login tracking, the additional login steps if there was perceived risk to the login, and the ability to reverse the account takeovers, combined with all the anti-phishing stuff that we were already doing to block all the fake emails coming from the site, dramatically reduced the scope of what we were having to deal with. And it let us focus on some of the other things that we had to work with. These people were still very determined, though. So let me not beat around the bush there. So let's talk about the fraud. So what about the fraud? When you're dealing with marketplace fraud, there are some very common scams. And so one of the biggest ones that we dealt with, we dealt with them on both sides. So first, you'd have the fake listings scam buyers. And so what that's going to look like is somebody puts up a listing for a piece of merchandise that is in great condition and the price is far too good to be true. So if you were to browse around on the site, you typically would find a listing that was something like a $5,000 piece of equipment, and you might see this for $3,000. And you go, wow, that's a steal. I've got to go get that. And you'll contact the seller, and they'll start to kind of encourage you to take that conversation over to your personal email because they don't want a trail. They'll tell you it's to avoid site fees or something like that, but they just don't want a trail. The seller will try to insist that you wire the money to them with Western Union. The reason they want to do this is because as soon as you do that, it's irreversible. You can't challenge that transaction to get your money back. They'll lead you on over time with, stories of shipping delays or that something's taking forever or they're just really, really busy and haven't been able to actually get it shipped out. Sometimes they might ship an entirely different product so that you can see something coming to them, or it'll go to a different address, or they'll typo your address or something like that. If anything ever even arrives, but that's how it will work. And then they'll get your money. And they'll create these fake listings, usually with a stolen credit card, in order to pay the price to get the listing up there. So then we have to deal with the chargebacks, which is always fun. The fake purchases to scam sellers, on the other hand, you might ask, how in the world would somebody scam a seller? Well, here's the pattern. And I was kind of shocked the very first time I heard about this, but this is a real legitimate thing. A purchaser will go and buy your item, and then they will send you a check for significantly more than the item actually cost. You, as a seller, get that check and go, oh, wow, this is far too much for what this item was supposed to cost. I need to fix this. I'm going to call them and let them know. The buyer will have a conversation. Oh, gosh, what a mistake. I'm sorry that happened. You know what? Go ahead and just cash the check and just Western Union me back the difference. And so the seller says, okay, cash the check. They're going to go Western Union the difference, and then they're going to go ahead and get that merchandise in the mail to you. And then the buyer will challenge the check before it clears, and they will get the wired difference back and the seller's merchandise, and the seller gets nothing. And then, to add insult to injury, when the buyer gets the merchandise, they will turn around and list it for sale. So finally, there is a little bit of justice in this. Federal government finally, mercifully, went after Western Union for enabling this problem for such a very, very, very long time. And they are still paying out money to victims of these scams. But it's ridiculous that it was allowed to go on as long as it did. But, like I said, these folks are determined. So when we made it harder to take over accounts, the scammers just started moving their business to new accounts. So to deal with this, we had user trust scores. And so if you've ever been to an online marketplace, you've seen user trust scores. People will put in transaction reviews and people will get a score next to their name based on successful transactions. People will say, paid on time or arrived in exactly the condition expected. They'll get stars or whatever else to bump up that rating. And that's great for the established users of the site. But for a new user, it's really difficult to even get involved once that happens, because you create a new account and you have nothing to start with. And so we had a user trust score going on behind the scenes. It was based on a lot of different factors. Excuse me. It was based on a lot of different factors of things that we were putting in. But for new users, we needed a way to let them leapfrog and kind of get a boost to that initial base score they started with. And so they could do that by verifying themselves with some extra steps. They could do a text or phone verification. That's why a lot of apps on your phone or apps that you'll sign into today will insist on getting your phone number. And it's not because they're trying to be nosy necessarily. It's usually just because they're trying to prevent fraud. And there are actually some APIs out there that we found. I think it was actually through MaxMind, or it might have been through a different service that MaxMind was using. But basically, it would let you type in a phone number, and you could identify whether it was a landline, a cell phone, a VoIP number, or a disposable or payphone number. And so you could limit it to say, okay, we're only going to allow you to do this verification with either a landline or a cell phone. You could also use a credit card to do verification. And since we didn't want to get chargebacks every time somebody tried to verify a stolen credit card, you could use this wonderful service from MaxMind called MinFraud. And what it basically did was you entered the account number and the payment information, the billing information, all that, and whatever address you were going to use to have stuff shipped to it. And it does a lot of different metrics on, the distance between the billing address and the receiving address, and some other lookups and everything to give you a risk score to that credit card. And you get that risk score before you run the charge, so that you don't have to deal with a chargeback when you run a charge on a risky card, because every single chargeback costs like $35 or $40, something ridiculous. And so by doing that, by successfully verifying, you could bump up that base score. And the other thing you wanted to do was you wanted to take advantage of those trust scores to adjust the strictness of your rules, because well-established users shouldn't have to jump through all these hoops, because they're established users of the site. They're actively participating in transactions. They're doing the right things. They're doing what's supposed to be there. So you want to get out of their way so they can keep doing what they're doing. Give them a better user experience. And so you utilize the trust score based on the higher the score, the lower your strictness. And you also won't end up needing to reduce scores whenever you find people using VPNs or Tor to engage in transactions, which you can also identify. And just to step back on that, there are, of course, legitimate reasons to use VPNs and Tor. But when you're dealing with the protective side of protecting your users in a situation like this, when you find that all of the bad actors are trying to perpetuate their crimes from behind VPNs and Tor, and you try to go through and engage in a transaction using them, and you're like, but no, I'm okay, I'm good. You're still walking through the enemy's battle lines while we're trying to fight them off. You need to come around. All right, another thing, we're going to bring communication in-house. So we put an on-platform messaging system so that people could communicate for these transactions. They can negotiate, they could ask questions about merchandise without having to expose anyone's email addresses. Finally. Also, it allowed us to scan the messages that were happening in these conversations to identify malicious patterns. If you were to find the words Western Union or some various way of referencing Western Union, we could post a warning to the person receiving the message from you to say, hey, here's a list of potential scams that can happen when people are using Western Union. You need to be aware of this. Or if they're encouraging people to move over to email, we can warn them about why somebody is going to be doing this. It gives a better user experience too, to have the on-platform chat system where you can quick reference details about the item you're discussing. This led to a very significant decrease in the reports that we were getting of transaction fraud, both from a standpoint of the user trust scores and the in-house communications. The more things were, I think the best way I've ever heard it put is when you turn on the light, the roaches scatter. And that's basically what happened. Once everything was brought into view, everything started getting better. But when the scams were in our view, people just continued doing the scams in our view. And they would also started using our own messaging platforms and messaging systems to spam our users. So, and it wasn't just the bad guys who were the problem. The competitors that we talked about were using our platform to actively go through and solicit the buyers and sellers on our site to try to get them to come to their site. They'd take a message and just paste it to user after user after user after user. The fraudsters would actually do the same type of thing. They would just try to blanket out messages and just see who bites, to see who comes back that they can start engaging with to get into a transaction. The users that didn't fall for it were still irritated that they were getting these junk messages and there wasn't anything that they could do about it. And so at one point, we were pretty sure people were actually just trying to get people frustrated by the messaging system so they wouldn't want to use it. By contributing to make it a bad experience. And you couldn't just take one of these accounts and just go, all right, you know what, we're just going to ban them, because they just go create another and keep at it. So we had to figure out a creative way of dealing with this. And this is when I learned one of the most important lessons in the world of anti-fraud. And it will carry, you can find lots and lots of reading material about this from other people who have realized the same thing. Fraud is a business. Spam, scams, all of it is a business. And the only way the business works is with a good return on investment. And in a business like this, these guys are investing their time. You know you can't stop them, but you can waste the crap out of their time. You can make them spend hours and hours and hours manually filling out forms, and then you can be amused by it. This was probably the most fun thing that we did. And I got a lot of joy out of it. So let me tell you how we did it. So first, you needed to be able to detect spam. And we looked at some third-party spam services, but they were all geared towards specific purposes, like comment form spam and stuff like that. Then ultimately, it isn't really that hard to build your own anti-spam algorithm. There's a formula out there called the Levenstein distance algorithm. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But it lets you basically detect the distance between two strings or words. And the distance is basically, what does it take to, how many letters do I have to change to turn this one into this one? And so there's a good example on Wikipedia if you ever look up the algorithm there, and the link's down at the bottom right here. But the distance between kitten and sitting, for example, is 3. And the way that you get to that is, you take kitten and sitting, and you have to change the K to an S. And then you have to change the E to an I. And then you have to add the G. So that's 1, 2, 3 steps to change kitten into sitting. If 2 strings are equal, the distance is 0. The distance cannot be greater than the length of the longer string, because if it was, you would have just replaced the shorter string with the longer string. And so you have a bounds. You have a range of 0 to the length of the longer one. If you can detect really quickly whether they're equal, so you're not having a 0 in the formula at all if you want to. But you can get a very simple similarity percentage by just comparing 2 strings, even paragraphs of text, and taking the distance divided by the max length, and you'll get that similarity percentage. And so we did that. And so what we did was we applied this check. If somebody was sending a message, we would look at some range of prior messages that the account had sent to see how many similar messages were in there from the one that they were trying to send. Sometimes you go, the most recent 10 messages, maybe you go the most recent 20. If the message that is being sent is too similar to previous messages that have been sent, you will flag it as a potentially spammy message. You also, again, you don't want to bother your established user. So you're going to use that user trust score to determine how strictly you want to enforce this. And so what we called it internally was we called it our similarity threshold. And so if you had a low user trust score, you would also have a low similarity threshold, and it would only need to match on a certain set of messages. So if you had a low trust score, for example, and your message was 50% similar to 5 of the last 10 messages that you've been sent out, we would track it. If you had a high trust score, then maybe we say, it's got to be 95% similar in 48 of 50 messages. Somebody who's actually running a business on the site and is actually distributing marketing messages to people who've been previous customers or something along those lines. And you don't want false positives here, because you don't want to interrupt somebody's actual business dealings. And so we ended up implementing a catch and release process. So once something was flagged, it wasn't just blocked outright, it was just delayed. And it would be delayed, and then for a few hours, for about 8 hours or so, we would wait and see what other behavior that user had over an 8-hour period. And if they had additional flag messages over that period of time, if they had a lot of them, then maybe we said, okay, well, this guy's clearly just trying to continue to send lots and lots and lots of spam, so we're going to not deliver the message if the behavior continued, and we'll flag the account. But if they had sent 10 messages and the last couple of them got flagged from something similar, and that was really all they were doing for the day, at that point, we'll just go ahead and deliver them. There'll just be a slight delay of a few hours. So, if somebody went in and sent 200 messages after, the 10th message got flagged and it was still spammy, this is a spammer. We're going to flag that account. And periodically you want to manually review so you can tune the algorithm. That's the basics of it. And it works. It works great. We call that our catch and release process. And so step 2, start wasting their time. This is where we bring in the CAPTCHAs. So after somebody has sent a certain amount of messages, we're going to start making them fill out a CAPTCHA for every single message that they're sending. In order to do that, we're going to follow our same principle. We're going to use our trust scores to determine how strictly we want to do this. If you have a low score, your second message, you're going to start filling out CAPTCHAs. If you're a brand new user, you're going to be filling out CAPTCHAs quickly. If you're running an entire business on the site and you've got a very high score, maybe you'll start filling out CAPTCHAs after about 100 messages or something like that. Your goal is to ensure people are manually having to enter the stuff to avoid the various bots that are out there. Now, this is critical. Once you catch a spammer, you cannot just ban them. We already talked about this, because if your algorithm catches them and then you cancel the account, they're just going to go create a new account and start the whole process over. But if you shadow ban them, this is where the fun happens. If you shadow ban them, you identify their account, you know they're a spammer. From that point forward, when you've confirmed this is a spamming account, you deliver none of their messages, but you don't tell them. You give them the appearance that their messages are still being delivered. And you allow them to send messages to other accounts that you've identified are either linked to the user or have already also been identified as spammer accounts. So spammers can't just send each other messages to test if their messages are being delivered, because then it will look like they are. Keeps them from easily identifying whether or not they've been caught. And so what they'll do is they'll spend hours and hours and hours sending messages, filling out CAPTCHAs every single time for messages that are never, ever delivered. And then you get to waste as much of their time as they have of yours. Step 4, purgatory. Eventually, you do have to ban the account or they will realize something is up. You were previously catching them all the time and suddenly you haven't caught them in forever. What's going on? Well, you have to ban the shadow ban user. So what we set it up to do was to use a random time interval within about 2 weeks. And it was completely random. There was never it could have been anywhere from, I think, 6 days to 14 days. That would ban the account so the person would realize, oh, they caught me, and then they'll go and create a new account. So they still think they had some range of days to work with there while nothing was getting through. And then they're going to go create a new account. Now, when they do that, you can still track the user from account to account. And when you do that, when they go create the new account, you immediately flag it as a spammer. You immediately start your 2-week clock again. They're still filling out CAPTCHAs from day one, and nothing is ever getting through. This person has been rendered no longer a nuisance. And the fun thing about this is that the thing that I've learned about this is that every time I'm reading something on Hacker News where I hear about some dirty marketing technique or fingerprinting technique, the very first thought that I have is I can catch scammers with that. Because what we did back in the day was there was a library called EverCookie that was a essentially undeletable cookie. It would load into your Flash or in your browser, and it would spread itself across your entire computer. So it was virtually impossible to get rid of. And so whenever we found a spamming user, we would infect them with an EverCookie, so that whenever they went to a new account, we saw the EverCookie show up. You're the same guy. Doesn't matter if you've got a different IP address or whatever else, you're the same person. There are modern fingerprinting techniques that are out there, but all these really creepy user tracking techniques that are out there, they're really, really great techniques for security and anti-fraud work. So keep that in mind whenever you read about those things. Don't let your first thought be, how do I block this? Think, how can I use this for the greater good? And one of the other fun things that we can do is honeypot credentials. And so if you find out about a phishing site, for example, what you can do is you can go submit some fake credentials to the phishing site's login page. And then when somebody tries to log in with those fake credentials that you knew were submitted to the phishing site that only the scammer would have, you immediately flag their account. So one of the things that we did for our entertainment, and this brought us a lot of joy, is we created a dashboard of the amount of time these people were wasting typing in captchas when we had verified and caught the spammers. And we called it time wasted by these poor, use your imagination. But you'd look up at the dashboard and on the screen in the office, and you would see the leaderboard essentially of people who were just sitting there filling out captchas all day and never getting through. And after as much time as we had put into stopping these guys, and after the nuisance that they caused, it really brings you some joy. The worst offender was spending 15 hours a day manually sending messages and filling out captchas every single time. And I really appreciate that. And so the result of doing all this is that by the time we were done, we had created the safest marketplace in the entire industry. And that is essentially the story of the time I accidentally spent a year combating phishing and fraud. And there's obviously only so much you can work into a presentation. I know I'm a little over an hour here right now. There's more to the story if you want to check out the entire blog series. There are details that I will only tell in private conversations because it was a very intense year, but it was definitely a great experience. And so I'm glad y'all let me, it was a great experience in hindsight. It was a great learning experience. It wasn't a great experience going through it, but thank y'all for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Barry. That was wild to listen to. What a wild ride you had there. And I love the idea of wasting the time of the time wasters. That is delightful. I'm sure you've seen some of the videos online of people who waste the time of spam callers and things
Oh
like
yeah.
that. I don't know why I find that so delightful, but
No, somebody
yeah.
even built an app to do it automatically for you. And I remember seeing somebody had used some type of system on their email to basically use an AI bot to engage with spam email and start replying and having a conversation with somebody who was having spam emails with them. And it's the same principle. The more they're spending time wasting time on you, the less time they're spending wasting somebody else's time. And so you can't stop them, but you can delay them and slow them down.
Yeah. Yeah, really great. Well, we'll post the links that you had there in our Discord, and just thank you again for presenting tonight to DevSecCon Virginia chapter. It's really good, and the video will be live on the YouTube channel for anybody to circle back and see. So much appreciated.
All right. Thanks a lot, Micah.
All right.